After discussing how St. Thomas Aquinas sees the existence of God as a preamble of the faith, and also after clarifying what Aquinas actually means with his 5 ways in contrast to many of the misconceptions about them, it is time now to discuss the 5 ways as a brief overview prior to discussing each of them one by one. St. Thomas Aquinas says, when an effect is better known to us than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause. Hence, the existence of God, insofar as it is not self-evident to us, can be demonstrated from those of his effects, which are known to us. What does he mean by this? He means by this that God in himself is incomprehensible. Therefore, we cannot know the fact that God exists just from knowing his essence. Why? Because it is impossible for us to have a complete grasp of his essence. This is his rationale for rejecting the ontological argument from St. Anselm of Canterbury. Now, in the Summa Theologiae, in question 2, I think, Article 1 and Article 2, he clarifies why we have to prove, or we can prove, the existence of God. Sir Peter Crave writes, in Article 1, St. Thomas shows that God's existence is not so obvious that it heeds no proof. And in Article 2, he shows that it is not so obscure that it cannot be proved. Thus, he refutes both extremes of dogmatism and skepticism about the existence of God. In other words, some would say that the existence of God is already very self-evident, such that proofs for God's existence are no longer needed. St. Thomas Aquinas rejects that position. Why? Because in Article 1, he lays out the fact that to be self-evident is to be impossible to be rejected. Whereas Scripture itself says that the fool says in his heart there is no God. In other words, there is a possibility that one could reject the proposition that God exists. And that shows that it is not self-evident to us. So, he refutes dogmatism, the view that it is no longer needed to give reasons to in our belief in the proposition that God exists. He also rejects skepticism, or extreme skepticism, wherein God's existence is impossible to be proven or to be known. It can be known, and the way we can know the existence of God is from his effects. It is important to keep in mind that the intention of St. Thomas Aquinas, his rationale for laying out certain proofs for the existence of God, is not to write some polemics against some skeptics. Rather, Dr. Given Kerr writes, Aquinas is led to proofs for the existence of God out of a concern of a scientific understanding of reality. Having got to a certain point in metaphysics and the intelligible articulation of the nature of reality, Aquinas is led to consider whether or not there is a principle on which all reality is based. In other words, his proofs flow out of his metaphysics of the world. Aquinas says 5 proofs do not just conjure up the existence of God out of his metaphysics, rather the metaphysics that he already has prior to his demonstrations or attempt to prove that God exists, already in themselves point to the direction that God exists, and making explicit how such metaphysics points to the existence of God is Aquinas' intent in writing proofs for God's existence. Okay, so St. Thomas Aquinas talks about proving God's existence from his effects. Okay, for example, you are along a road, you're riding your car or any mode of transportation, or you're just walking on a road, and you see at a distance some smoke. So you see smoke rising at a distance. Now, first, you observe that you really see the smoke. It is real, a real feature of the world, that there is such a smoke that you can observe. And then, you infer that the cause of that smoke must be capable of producing smoke. And what is something that is capable of producing smoke? Fire. So, just by seeing the smoke, you infer the existence of fire. So, from an effect, which is smoke, you inferred the existence of the cause, which is fire. Okay, so that is an analogy of how St. Thomas Aquinas structures his 5 ways. Stage 1 reasons from the existence of certain data or datum to the existence of an ultimate cause or explanation. An analogy. So you observe the smoke, and then you infer that something must exist that is capable of producing such an effect, which is the smoke. And without the cause, the effect cannot exist. Without something that can produce the smoke cannot exist. Then stage 2 follows, which proceeds to show that such an ultimate cause or explanation has to be God. In this analogy, you reasonably infer in stage 2 that such a cause which has causal power to effect the smoke, to bring about the effect which is smoke, has to be fire, because that is the nature of the fire, to bring about such an effect which is the smoke. Therefore, that is the 2-stage process of the demonstration of Aquinas. Father Thomas Joseph White writes, "You haven't experienced the fire, but you can demonstrate from the effect of the smoke that there is a fire." And that's an a posteriori argument. It's also called Akia demonstration in Latin, meaning through the effect you go to the cause that's hidden. So in other words, we can prove that God exists through his effects, and that is a method called an a posteriori argument, or Kia. Even if we have not directly seen the fire, we can know that it exists because we know its effect, which is the smoke. In the same way, by knowing certain features of the world, we infer that God must exist even if we have not directly seen God himself. Upon observing material things, we tend to observe them under different lights. We tend to analyze them under different lights. For instance, when we observe a cup of coffee, we first understand it as sensible. For instance, we tend to see the cup of coffee as brown, or meaning as having a certain quality that makes it look to us as brown. It also is analyzed by us in terms of its taste. Also, according to how hot it is, or according to how good it smells. In other words, we analyze it as it is sensible. When we analyze being as sensible, we are under the realm of natural science. Now, we also are able to analyze being not just as sensible, but also as quantifiable. We can measure, for example, how many liters this cup of coffee, or not liters, but milliliters, this cup of coffee contains. We can also measure how hot it is. For example, it is 80 degrees Celsius. So, when we analyze being as quantifiable, we are under the realm of metaphysics. Now, on a deeper level, deeper even than natural science and mathematics, we are under the realm of metaphysics. In metaphysics, we analyze being as being. We just analyze the cup of coffee as being.
Is it a substance or is it an artifact? In what sense is it actual? What are its potentialities? So, in metaphysics, we analyze being as being.
The data that Aquinas appeals to as uh, the effects from which we can infer the existence of God are of five kinds. First, he appeals to the reality of change or motion. He also appeals to the reality of efficient causality. He also appeals to the fact of contingency. He also appeals to the fact of the grades of being, gradations of being, which we will discuss later. There is more or less in things. And also, he also appeals to the fact of finality, final causality, or teleology. So, that's how he begins, with certain observable facts about the world. He then continues with certain metaphysical analysis of such datum or data. For example, when it comes to change, he draws out the metaphysical principles of actuality and potentiality. From the fact of causation, he draws out the fact of the metaphysics behind it, of essence and existence. From contingency, he draws out form and matter. From the degrees of being, he draws out the transcendentals. From finality or directedness, he draws out teleology, which is immanent to the thing. Now, from the metaphysical analysis, he then leads us to the conclusion that such data must have a certain kind of fundamental cause. For example, change must ultimately need a purely actual actualizer. Therefore, if there are changing things, there must be a purely actual actualizer. From causation, he leads us to the conclusion that a fundamental cause, that is, subsistent existence of self, must exist. From contingency, he then leads us to the conclusion that an absolutely necessary being must exist. Then from the degrees of being, he then leads us to a fundamental cause of such degrees, which is being itself, truth itself, and goodness itself. And from the directedness that is evident in the world, he leads us to the conclusion that a fundamental cause, which is supreme intelligence, must exist. So, that is the first stage of Aquinas' strategy behind the five ways. Notice that in order to bridge the gap from the observed data to the fundamental cause, we must have to draw out the metaphysics behind the five ways. Therefore, we have to understand certain metaphysical prolegomena, such as act and potency, the four causes, causality per se, causality per accidens, substances and artifacts, essence and existence, contingency and necessity, the transcendentals, and so on, because they are necessary for us to be able to understand how the explanandum, the data, entails the explanans, a certain kind of being which must be the fundamental cause. And at the Summa Theologiae, he no longer explains in detail how such prolegomena are being worked out in the five ways. Why? As Dr. Ralph McInerney writes, at the outset of the Summa Theologiae, Thomas refers to the philosophical sciences as already known by his reader. In other words, he already presupposes that the reader of his Summa already knows the metaphysics that he is using in his five ways. He already assumes that the reader is already well versed about act and potency, contingency, and so on. He no longer feels the need to explicitly lay them out in detail. And such metaphysical prolegomena are very much interlocked. These system of ideas are very much interlocked, such that if you lose one, you lose all. As Dr. David Augerberg writes, the doctrine of substantial forms is but one part of a system of logically related concepts, principles, and distinctions. To lose one is to lose them all. So, if we do not understand act and potency, it would be very difficult for us to understand essence and existence. Essence as potentiality in relation to the act of existing. So we must understand them, and our understanding of them must be related to the others. We must not isolate one from the rest of the concepts within the metaphysical system of Aquinas. Father Herbert McCabe then writes, of course, if we are to know the cause, we must disentangle the characteristic effect of the cause from the shape which has been given to it by its circumstances. When we have isolated the precise formal effect of the cause, then we know the cause. In other words, to be able to understand what the cause is, the nature of the cause, we must be able to disentangle its formal effect, what really flows out from it, rather than accidental features that are surrounding the circumstances that we analyze. Father Herbert McCabe continues, if the characteristic effect of a thing is human, we say that its nature is to be human. With God, we say that his characteristic effect is the to be of things, and so his nature is to be. In other words, for example, when we go to the beach and you notice that on the sand there are some markings, and you see there a 4-letter word being written on the sand. For example, the word is book, B-O-O-K. You definitely infer that a rational animal must have produced such an effect. Why? Because a non-rational human or non-rational animal or something else that is not rational would not be able to produce such an effect with semantic content. Yes, it could be chance, but that is just an analogy. The point here is that from the nature of the effect, we infer the nature of the cause. If the effect is human, then we infer that the nature of the cause is human. It has human nature. There are some differences though with the analogy, because although there is some chance, even if how little, there is some chance that the 4-letter words are produced by chance rather than an intellect. The arguments by St. Thomas Aquinas do not appeal to chance, or do not appeal to probability, which gives way to chance, as we shall see. The point here being is that with God, Father Herbert McCabe says, the characteristic effect of God that is being talked about in the 5 ways, that is the point of the 5 ways, is God as the cause of the very existence of things. He is the very cause of the very being, of the very to be of things. Therefore, if his characteristic effect is the to be of things, then his nature is to be. Just as if the characteristic effect of a human is human, then if something has the characteristic effect, which is to be, the very existence of things, then he also must be to be. That cause must also be to be, or existence itself. And that is what we shall lay out in our discussion of the 5 ways. Each of them lead us to the conclusion that subsistent existence itself exists. And that is God himself, as we will lay out in stage 2. And in stage 2, we will be drawing out certain attributes of such a fundamental cause. And we shall see that its attributes are divine. Omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, or being fully good, mm, being love itself, and so on, transcendence, immanence, and so on. We shall draw out these characteristics from the fundamental cause, from the nature of the fundamental cause. And we then reason out that only God can have these key divine attributes. And we already know that this thing must exist. Why? Because these are the explanans of the explanandum, and the explanandum exists, therefore this fundamental cause must exist. Therefore, we conclude that God must exist given the explanandum. It is also very important to take note that the context is very important when talking about the five ways. Dr. De La Torre writes, "Some might argue that such a lengthy investigation can work against its intended conclusion by unnecessarily complicating matters, or that any proof for the existence of God must be nice and neat, easy to follow and accept, if it is to prove anything at all. This line of criticism is mistaken." In other words, our task, our goal of understanding the five ways and defending them should be complemented with hard work in establishing the context of the five ways. It will not do to say that if these arguments, these five ways, cannot be explained in 5 minutes, therefore they do not work. It just means that there's much more work to do in defending these certain premises that shall be fleshed out. For the details, Dr. Robert Kuhns writes, we need to refer to other texts of Aquinas, especially Summa Contra Gentiles and On Being and Essence, and to the texts upon which Aquinas is relying, especially those of Avicenna and Maimonides. We must not isolate the five ways from the context that Aquinas was writing in, from the world of ideas that he was breathing upon writing the five ways. It is also very important to point out that St. Thomas Aquinas also writes, "The believer's act does not terminate in the propositions, but in the realities which they express." We must not forget the fact that these demonstrations actually point to the realities that it proves that God exists, that he has these certain divine attributes. Let's not stop just with the propositions. We must go to the reality that God exists. That is the aim of the proof. To just stop at the propositions would be to mistake what Aquinas is doing. He is attempting to show that God really exists, and the propositions, the philosophical demonstrations, are just the means to showing that. The deeper dimension of this task is explained by Dr. Peter Graefe this way. When human reason proves God's existence, it is like a child finding his home and recognizing his father. In other words, this is the aim of the five ways, not just to end with the propositions, not just intellectual exercise of arguments. No, that's not all we are doing. The reality behind our attempts to prove that God exists is to help others, specifically atheists and agnostics, into the realization that they have a father waiting for them, which gave them human reason to lead them to the fact that he exists. So in other words, human reason is used by God to draw his children near to him. There are some arguments which are dependent upon modern physics, the results or the data from modern physics. That is not intrinsically wrong. You can do that. However, such arguments, if they put so much weight on such a source of data, which is the scientific enterprise, it is also subject to much change, precisely because the scientific enterprise is inductive by nature, the new data could overturn it. Therefore, those arguments that are based or built upon these data could be shaken and, in principle, are not ultimately conclusive because they will still be disproven by future data. St. Thomas's arguments are different. Why? Because they are built upon metaphysical principles which themselves are presupposed by the scientific enterprise. Therefore, they do not change the way science itself changes. Why? Science presupposes them at each moment that science operates. The philosophical principles, the metaphysical principles that Aquinas uses do not change across time. They remain as they are. Therefore, we can call the proofs that are built upon them to be perennial. They do not change across time. Therefore, as Father Battista Mondin writes, if one remembers these observations, then the argumentative value of the five ways remains solid and persuasive, even for the man of the 20th century.